Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the colorist of comics like Once and Future, Ludocrats, The Trap, and a whole lot more. It's Tamra Bonvillain. Thanks for coming on, Tamra.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So we're going to be talking a lot about the world of coloring today, but I wanted to actually start with the things that kind of got you into this world. And I feel like it's a really common story to a certain degree. It seems like we may have grown up roughly around the same time. Animated series like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, X-Men the animated series, Spider-Man, Batman the animated series. Before you got into comics, why were those such a, like a perfect foot in the door for you?
Yeah, I think I liked comics before that, but I was very young. So I'm born in 82, so, I was like, whatever, 6, 7. I get some random comics maybe that my parents might have given me or somebody. So I had like a vague interest, and then, just like, those are the cartoons that are on. Those are like the popular like Saturday morning block of cartoons. I already had that kind of built-in interest too. And, just kind of like, just that I had that pre-established like interest. So it like really grabbed me. And then, it's one of the more popular shows at the time for kids. So
I do think it's interesting because like when I was a kid, even though comics were considerably cheaper back then, besides like random Transformers comics and everything like that, it's not like I could just go to a shop and just buy whatever I wanted. I think it was kind of like an accessibility thing for me when I was a kid. Is just I knew I liked these things, and the fact that they were on the TV meant that I could actually engage with them in a specific way.
Yeah. And like even before that, before those, there were a lot of more like comics based shows like X-Men, Batman, all that. We'd rent videos a lot, and I would rent like those old like 60s cartoons, even like like the weird like Fantastic Four and stuff with the strange animation in them and all that. So I don't know. I guess I did have that interest even before there was a ton of those shows like easily available, like just on television.
Yeah. So they were always just kind of a nice gateway for you, even though like, they weren't comics themselves.
Right.
I read an interview with you that one of the first artists that really impacted you was Joe Madureira. And I love that because I remember when I was a kid and I first saw Joe's stuff, and it just, I don't know, it was just different. And it just completely blew me away because of that. And I'm curious because he was so manga influenced in a lot of ways, or seemingly manga influenced. What was it that stood out to you about Joe and his art?
I think it was like a perfect like storm of things, right? So like the X-Men cartoon, like that's like me coming off of that,
right? Watching
that. I would buy like some of those like X-Men adventure that were just adaptations of the show.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was, into like some anime manga stuff myself. Again, it was very limited at the time,
right?
What I could get at, especially at the age I was. And then, so him doing that, like combination of those things, like he was the first artist that I think I really latched onto in a big way. And that was the first time I got like a subscription to a comic on Uncanny X-Men. So yeah. And it's just like, it was kind of like, I was kind of doing that too, because I was influenced by like both like American comics and like Japanese comics, and so it was cool to see someone who was like doing it professionally with those same kind of influences.
So it was kind of like you both saw that this is possible. This is like a career you could have, but also you could have like the disparate interests that you already had and still make it on like something like X-Men.
Right. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, you were growing up, you were watching the cartoons, you were reading Uncanny, you had your subscription, everything like that. Were you always drawing and making your own comics alongside that, like when you were interested in all this stuff?
Yeah, I remember. I don't know what happened to them, but I remember like probably kindergarten, first grade, I was making these like weird like Mario Brothers comics or something. I remember doing those. So yeah, I definitely had an interest from a very young age. I don't know what really sparked it like right at first, because I was so young when I was doing that stuff. And I remember writing like little goofy stories like for like again like early elementary school. It's like very like comic booky type influences in them. So yeah, I was always doing that stuff, and like even before Joe Mad, but he was just the one that I like I said, really latched onto. Like I copied stuff from comics and like, that kind of thing you do when you're younger.
Oh yeah, I actually my parents dropped off a bunch of tubs of stuff that they had in the garage from when we were talking about moving before, from when I
Right.
moved last time, and I found a sketchbook from my childhood in there, and I'm not gonna lie, it is very bad. It is.
Yeah.
I apparently thought that every person in comics had to be like shredded to an unbelievable degree. I think I must have read too many like Bart Sears columns in Wizard magazine because my musculature was through the roof.
Yeah, have to find some of that stuff. Like I still have it, but a lot of that's at my parents' house, like so I need to get that at some point and bring it over here and take a little take a little trip looking through that stuff.
I do, a lot of artists I talk to say that they don't really like going back and looking at their previous work, whether it's, just something that they did a year ago even. I can't even
Yeah.
imagine like seeing what somebody would think of the stuff that they did when they were a kid. Although I hope that they would give themselves a little bit of leeway because they were a kid.
Right. I don't know. I've had this weird thing. Not that I go back and look at stuff all the time or anything, but like I've never had that problem. It always weirded me out, like going to art school and stuff. I had a few people I knew who like they would throw stuff away from the previous year at school. It's like, what are you doing? Like, why are you throwing all this away? I have this attachment to it. Like, even when it's bad, like I can look back on it and be like, there's something about it that I still like. Doesn't mean it's good, obviously. And it's hopefully get better over time. But there's still something there that's like it's cool to go back and revisit and see like where you were at different stages.
Yeah. Well, I kind of wonder if you look back at stuff that you had done previously, if maybe you recognize that something was lost as you improved, like
Yeah.
maybe like some sort of energy or some sort of, I don't know. Like I find that sometimes when I talk to artists like colorists and particularly people when they're inking, actually, there can be something to, I don't know what the right word for it is. It's like sometimes there can be happy mistakes.
Right.
And if you try to eliminate all those mistakes or all the stuff that like made you when you were first starting, maybe you're losing something in the process.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that, like whether it be coloring or drawing or whatever, like looking back, and sometimes it's like I still think that what I'm doing is overall better, but there's something here. It's like, oh, I don't do that anymore, and that's something I liked about like a quality that I did. So that's like a cool aspect to it. It's like nice just to see the progression sometimes too of like, oh wow, like I really did get better or something. And sometimes, usually not with too long of a period between, but like there's sometimes where you're working on something and you're just satisfied with it. And if you look at it a little bit later, you're like, you know what, this isn't as bad as I thought. Because at the time of working on it, it had so in my head of like what I wanted it to be, and it wasn't living up to that you kind of like lose that over time or something, and you just look at it for what it is, and it's like, oh, this is fine actually.
Yeah, because I imagine when you're in the process of something, and if, like, let's say you get really stuck when you're coloring the issue of Once and Future or something, and for some reason, like when you're in there, you have like that emotion tied to you. You're like, God, you're like, what the hell? I can't figure this out. But then later
Right.
on, I'm sure when you look at it, it's like, you're like, why was this so hard? I don't understand why this was so hard.
And I've tried over the years too to like kind of, especially now that I have to that I do it for a living and I have to do it quickly. There's times where you will hit those walls, and like for me, I just started getting to a point of like, well, I maybe don't know what I want to do here, or this is something about this doesn't feel great. But I'll do sometimes if I'm really stuck, I'll just be like, I'm just going to turn it in. If people don't like it, like the team, like the writer, artist, editors, everybody, like if they have something to say about this, like an actual concern, they'll tell me, and then I can adjust it. But there's no use like banging my head against the wall, like trying to do it, wasting all this time. And then a lot of times you turn it in and it's fine, so it really wasn't that big a deal. You just got yourself all worked up about it.
Yeah, I mean, it is, I think, ultimately one of those things where you can be your own worst critic. I just wrote this article on Tuesday, and I swear to God, I was fine-tuning it so much that, like, honestly, I don't think anyone in the world, it would have made any difference how, like, to what degree I was fine-tuning it. But it felt right at the end. And then, it still goes out in the world, and I'm like, I don't know if there'd be an appreciable difference to the average person who reads this.
Yeah. I mean, and, there's definitely times, too, when stuff goes out, and it's like, oh, I would have done this or that different. And it's like, but at the end of the day, it's just like, I think my time is better spent of like, I did what I could on this page, and I'll just take like what I learned from that and apply it to the next thing.
Yeah.
Assuming it's not something that breaks it, like if it's just like absolutely terrible. But like little small stuff that mostly, like you said, like you're going to notice and other people probably not going to notice that much.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned art school, and I did want to talk about that because I thought one of the interesting things when I was researching for this, it sounded like you kind of always wanted to go to art school specifically for comics. And you were kind of weighing your options, SCAD, et cetera, but you ended up going to the Kubert School. I'm curious, like, what made you realize you wanted to go learn how to make comics in specific, and how did you end up with the Kubert School as the one you wanted to go to?
Yeah, I'm sometimes curious about that myself. I don't remember what it was that like prompted me to switch, because I live in Georgia. Savannah is only like 2.5 hours away, so I had really had it like in my head of like, go here. If they got their sequential art program, and I even would get to use like the scholarship from in-state and like reduced tuition because I'm in-state, all that. Although it still probably would have been much more expensive
right.
overall going there. I think what probably prompted me is it's just like, oh, this is like an actual college where you got to take all these core classes and da 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 da. And it was like, I don't know, maybe that was part of it. Maybe it was the price. I don't really know. I think maybe there's something about like, I was reading X-Men a lot in the 90s. So yeah, I latched on to Joe Mad with Uncanny X-Men. But the other people drawing X-Men at the time were like Andy Kubert, Adam Kubert. Were doing a lot of X-Men related stuff. So I would still buy like a random like X-Men, not Uncanny X-Men, comic at the time. So I was seeing their stuff too, and I liked it, and like, so I had that like name recognition of like, oh, this is where the Kuberts teach, like the actual like people that work in the industry. Mm-hmm. I know they do at Savannah as well, but like, there was just like those names stood out to me more, and I think that was part of it. And then it was like a streamlined like 3-year process. It was cheaper. I guess that was part of it. I don't really know what it was, because I was going to a local college in Augusta at first, to get my cores out of the way in case I switched to to Savannah, so I didn't have to like save a little bit of money getting the just like literature and math classes and stuff out of the way.
Right.
But yeah, something switched it at some point, and I ended up going to the Kubert School.
Yeah, it seems like you kind of always knew you wanted to make comics, though.
Oh yeah, like I had little periods of doubt sometimes, but yeah, like I liked doing it from a young age. I was super into comics, like try to make comics with my friends, or like talk about making comics with my friends, like drawing all the time, reading comics, and I went to a art magnet school like in high school. So I was trying to do art like from a pretty young age, and like there was like a small period where I thought like maybe I want to do something with like games, but like that didn't last very long. I was just like, no. And even when I went to the this like local university here, at first I was going into it, I was like, okay, I'm going to be practical. I'm going to do like a regular major. I'm still going to try to do art, but if it doesn't work out, I got to back up. And so like the first year or two, I was just taking core classes to like bide my time figuring out what I wanted to major in. I was just like, no, I'm just going to major in art. So that I just switched to doing art classes anyway, and never really like, I never really went for like the backup career, It's just like, I was like, I'm just going to go head first into this and try to do art stuff somehow.
That was a solid choice. I actually went to school where my minor was basically writing, and I always wanted to write. That was just something I always wanted to do. And I got my majors were both in like business school, so I got degrees in marketing and then business or human resources and business management, to be more specific. And the funny thing is instead of having my backup career, I ended up basically just having 2 jobs where I have a site where I write all the time and I do this podcast, and then I also have my day job where I work in an advertising agency. So it's a solid choice not doing that, because then you might just find yourself having 2 jobs like me.
Yeah, it's there's definitely times where it was like scary, and it took a while to really take off, but I got lucky, like it worked out for me, so I'm glad I went that way.
Well, and I did actually want to ask about the Kubert School experience in specific, because I know one of your classmates actually. I'm in Anchorage, Alaska, and I'm friendly with Tad Galusha. And I'm curious on your perspective on what the experience at the Kubert School was like, because based off of interviews, it seems like it was specifically one. I'm trying to remember. I think it was Gabe Bridwell. Mm-hmm. It seems like maybe from what I understand, like the Kubert School, you really kind of have to learn a lot about different things in comics. It's not just one path. It's like kind of learning a lot of the paths. How did that help you figure out what you wanted to do in comics? And like, did that help route you on to becoming a colorist?
Yeah, I think it did. I mean, I enjoyed my time there quite a bit. Like more than anything, what it did is like gives you a little taste of what it's going to be like when you work in comics, of like the intensity of workload you have and deadlines and stuff. I mean, you're kind of used to that with like homework, and even when I did art in college, there's some of that, but it's like way more intense and it's more specific on what you're going for. You're doing comic pages and things like that.
Right.
And yeah, you're doing like lettering, you're doing coloring. When I was there, they were still had a few like older like paste up and like physical paste up and mechanical stuff and things like that. But it's neat to learn that stuff. And like you mentioned, Gabe Bridwell, he was kind of like trying to help transition them into like modernity a little bit, with like using computers and things like that, which we did. And I had a little bit of experience already anyway. Like I'd messed around with Photoshop before going to the Kubert School, and I was doing flats for a coloring studio, so I know how to do that stuff, at least like the setup. But yeah, like just the intensity of the work, constantly doing it, getting feedback. It was nice to have like environment of other people that were also interested in the same thing. That was very like motivating.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as with coloring, it didn't necessarily push me to coloring, although I do feel like coloring was a strong suit of mine. Like, and I always liked that part of the process. Like, it's probably my favorite part of the process. And a thing that really benefited me from going to the Kubert School is when you go out, and if you're good at coloring, you have a lot of people that want to draw and maybe aren't great at coloring, and they want a colorist, and they know you from there. So you know them that way. But you also get like connections just in general from knowing these comics people. Not necessarily you're going to, pretty much no one from there lands the like Marvel DC jobs that you kind of dream of, like when you go there thinking that's what you're going to get. But you still connect with a lot of people. And the fortunate thing about being a colorist is you connect with a lot of people.
Right.
Because you connect with some of these artists that works with a writer. That writer maybe ends up doing something, down the line with a different artist. So you like those people like shuffle around even, and they'll recommend you to a friend, or you work with them and they start doing stuff. Like I know there was a point where like I had a direct line of like from working at the Kubert School to like where I started feeling like I was getting really established, because like I met oh God, I don't know. It's just like, like the web of connections like got me to these like bigger books, and it was like a pretty direct line. And then after there, it's just like, kind of self-sustaining at a certain point.
Yeah. I imagine, because you're also close to New York at that point too. So New York is in many ways like I don't know. It's hard if there is an epicenter for comics anymore. It's kind of everywhere at this point. But at the same time, it's like you are close to that. You do have all those connections. I think that's a very underrated part about the art school element, is especially pre-internet, before it was just like putting yourself out there and like trying to make connections that way. It back then, this is going to date me, but you're going to get the reference. It's like, having that Rolodex accessible to you and trying to be able to find potential partners or find paths to potential collaborators and everything like that. That's a huge deal.
Yeah. And yeah, there's definitely a lot of people like hovering around that school too. they know, they know that there's artists coming out of here, and like maybe I can find someone new to work with. So it was great. And the connection thing, I 100% agree. I think that's more than anything probably that I was taught. Like connections are the biggest thing to come out of it. Yeah, just you can't. Some people may be better at going to cons, hustling, meeting people otherwise without going to school. No, it's not for everybody. But like I've never been good at that kind of stuff. So like having a more organic like connection with like these are people I went to school with and I saw them every day, and like they know this person and can vouch for you and all that stuff like that. That was really huge for me.
Yeah. Did you initially view it as a path to drawing comics, or were you always kind of open to whatever like the experience took you to?
I liked coloring before going there, and I kind of did a lot of stuff too, though. Like I I'd like to do just like illustration stuff, color my own stuff, or do like digital painting things, drawing, comics. As I got there, I just feel like that was the stronger area, and like I was still trying to do both, but like the coloring thing kind of picked up quickly, and once it picked up steam, it went really fast. So at a certain point, it's like not so much that I didn't have interest in drawing, just that I didn't have time.
Right.
And it's like, well, why am I? I'm not going to try to like, I'm doing well at this. Like I'm getting work. I don't have to fight for it and stuff. So it's like, this is fine. Like I enjoy it. I enjoy this part of the process, and it's going well. Like there was definitely like those awkward periods at first where you're like trolling these like job boards and stuff, where it's like trying to get things going. But that takes a lot of luck too. And if you're doing doing art, it's a big time investment of doing the drawing of a book. And sometimes you get people that are kind of sketchy or flaky, like writers or, like that I would be working with. And it's just like, I got burned on those a couple of times, and it's just like, was annoying. And even if you get someone who's kind of flaky, if you're coloring, it's usually like you did a few pages and you're done. So it's like, well, I'll never deal with this person again.
Right.
And maybe that was a few days versus if you're drawing it, that's like a bigger time investment. And, it's just like, well, coloring's going easily right now and I'm getting other jobs. So it's like, I just, that just kind of dominated what I was doing. But yeah, going into the school, like, I was open to other things, but like, of course, like you're primarily going there, like drawing and stuff.
Sure. I do think it's interesting sometimes, and I didn't mean to make it sound like this, that like other roles in comics, like color, or not other roles, but like coloring and lettering and things like that could be perceived as like a foot in the door. But, especially now, I mean, like the list of colorists who do incredibly well for themselves is growing increasingly. There's so many people that do. I mean, we were talking about Matt Wilson before. I mean, Matt is always coloring like 6 books at a time. And I don't think he went into comics like thinking that he was going to become like, I don't know, like Daniel Clowes or something like that. He came in, and I think he was in like, God, whose studio was it? Lee Lowridge or yeah. And anyways, but I mean, it doesn't always, it's not always a means to an end. It's like sometimes it just happens to be what speaks to you. But I did want to ask, you mentioned that you were flatting for a studio. And, for listeners that don't know, and you can correct me if I terribly explain this, but basically it's prepping the page for the colorist. That's what a flatting is.
Right. It's like, you like, basically like doing the coloring book style version of it, where you just fill in every separate item as its own color, so it's easy to select when you're in Photoshop, and it saves a lot of time.
Yeah, I'm interested in, like, that was something that you were doing. It sounded like as you were at the Kubert School, basically. Is that, this is, I'm curious. It seems like most colorists start where they're flatting first. It's almost like kind of part of the path. Is that a thing? Is it sort of like a rite of passage, or is it really just dependent on the person?
I think it really depends. I know there's some like D Cunoff right now. Like he works, or he might still work with Matt, like doing flats and stuff, and he's out doing coloring on his own. I worked at the studio. Now it's weird because I didn't directly get work coloring from working at that studio, because the studio closed down when I was in the Kubert School. And I didn't really leverage those connections. That's probably more on my part than anyone else's, just like, I don't know. I've always felt, like I said, I was never good at being pushy or like hustling in that way. But it gave me a lot of experience, like just, doing flats, working in Photoshop, like prepping stuff for coloring, working for a colorist, what they need. And, I've known a variety of people, like some of them, started out flatting for other people. Some of them didn't, and probably couldn't flat their own stuff, maybe. But yeah, it's like anything, I guess. Like, there's various paths to get to where you end up being. Yeah.
I imagine, though, that that's actually kind of helpful in some ways. I mean, not saying that you want to do it for like a super long time or something, but at the same time, it's kind of like the Kubert School. It helps you understand the process maybe a little bit more holistically. So what goes into that, and then when you're actually getting into the coloring, you kind of understand the process of the flatting as well.
Yeah, and like deadlines and stuff. Like being able to produce work on a time schedule, is huge, and can be like a difficult thing to get used to.
Yeah. Well, before we jump into some specific projects and collaborations, well, sort of, because I'm actually bringing up a specific project here, but I want to talk process and like what exactly a colorist does for listeners that don't know. So for this, using Once and Future as an example, your book with Kieran Gillen and Dan Mora, which I'm actually had an issue come out today, so very well timed accidentally. So I'm not going to use a specific page, but I'm curious, like for a book like that, what is your process from start to finish for coloring a page or issue of that book? Like, do you start with script or where do you go?
Well, luckily on that book, I almost always have all the pages in the script, of course, like before I get started, which is my ideal way to work.
Yeah.
It doesn't always happen, but it is great because I like to have the whole context of what's going to happen in an issue. It makes it easier to make decisions.
Well, it helps you understand tone and mood too, right?
Right. And sometimes just like physically what is happening, like sometimes artists like to skip around pages. They don't even go in order. So it's like, you'll have a page that's after an establishing scene that the establishing scene doesn't exist yet. And I was like, I don't know what's going on. So it's hard to make a decision of how to color this because then you'll see an establishing scene. It's like, oh, this doesn't make sense because this was here and this was here. So luckily on this one, I pretty much every time I have all the pages and, I try to, sometimes if I'm rushed, I don't have the luxury of doing this, but I like to sit down with the art and I'll read the script looking at the art as I go through. So it kind of like, there's things that maybe aren't immediately obvious in the art that there's like a script note and it's like, oh, okay, I understand what's happening or like we're going for this thing here. And it helps me like just build a bigger, like the full picture of what I'm going to do. And then for something like Once in Future or any book that I've been doing for a while, one of the good things is you have kind of a backlog of stuff already. So sometimes you're going to the same location or whatever. So you have like some of the puzzle pieces already. So it's like, okay, I know the scene will look like that. And, but then there's like a new scene. So it's like, I want to make this distinct from that in this way. And, it gives you something to build off of instead of starting from scratch.
Mm-hmm. That definitely would make a huge difference. I'm curious though as to, well, I guess I understand because if you were getting, like, let's say you got page 12 in an issue before you got the first 11, it would be really difficult to imagine it. But it's like, how atypical is that experience for Once and Future where you kind of have everything to work with from the start?
It's really kind of random. Like some books I will have it, but a lot of books, especially with Marvel and DC where they're moving, faster, I do prefer when people work in order, at least. I understand if they don't, you got to do what works for you. But, or at least like if they're not all done, like I can at least start close enough to the deadline that we do have all the pages in, or at least most of the pages, and that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
It's also fine if they skip around, if it's by a scene by scene basis and not just randomly doing a page,
right.
Like later. And it's, again, I have missing information.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I just prefer to go in order, too, because it helps me keep continuity in mind of, like, something, maybe somebody, like, takes off a jacket or, like, does, like, something happens that changes the state of things. And when you go back and forth, sometimes it's easy to forget, like, to lose where you're at there. But if you're going in order, it's very clear, like, progression of what's happening.
So basically, like, if that, let's say that hypothetical situation where you start with page 12, that wouldn't be that big of an issue if it was the first part of a scene where, you can start fresh, it's almost like page 1 in some ways. It's the start of a scene.
Yes. And sometimes what I'll do, especially if it's a bigger time crunch, is I have all the pages and I'll do that. And what I'll do is, especially if it's a new scene, like it's either a new book or it's an issue where there's a lot of stuff that hasn't been previously established. I go like, okay, so I'll do the first page of this. or at least the most representative. It's not always the first page that is, the one with a big establishing shot or a clearer picture of what's going on. So I try to take so I'll do like maybe 4 or 5 pages that are kind of representative of the whole issue. So I can do that. And if we have any issues, we can iron that out up front.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so for the rest of the issue, my mind is like, I have that weight off my mind of like, okay, now I know what I'm doing. I don't have to have like any kind of like doubt or worry that they're going to not be okay with this. And I can just kind of like breeze through the rest of the issue. There may still be notes, but they're not going to, hopefully, they're not going to be like fundamental, big changes.
Right. That actually relates to something I was going to ask about. So, like, Once in Future, again, for an example, it's like issue 13 came out this week. Do you find, is the work that's up front for like an issue 1 where you're creating the palette and figuring out what you want a project to look like and kind of maybe dealing with collaborators a little bit more directly, is that considerably more work than what you deal with on like that issue 13 where it's more your playbook has been set up. You know what you're going for, where it's more all execution.
Oh yes. Because that's where you actually have to, like, especially if it's an artist I haven't worked with before, where I have to, like, really figure things out. And even sometimes if it's the same artist, if it's something totally different from what we've done before, there's a thing of figuring that out. Or if there's like specific kind of visual things that are like very unique to a book, to figure them out. Another thing that often happens, which is very stressful, is, you're starting a new book. It's like, oh, it's due a month or two from now. Like, whatever, it's fine. It's down the line. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, except we need 5 pages for a preview.
Oh, right.
Or something like that. And it's like, oh no, because now you have to do what is the hardest part of starting a new book, kind of like in the middle of all your other stuff. And that part is the most stressful for me, like coming up with that. It's not always difficult, but like there can be that kind of like nervousness if it's new people you're working with, because like, I don't know if this person's going to be picky or whatever, or if I'm giving them exactly what they want, especially if it's unclear what's being asked of you. But usually once that's done, like especially once you're done with the first issue, it's pretty much clear sailing from there, unless someone is just a real nightmare. But I've rarely experienced anyone that was that much of a nuisance.
Yeah. And previews are weird sometimes, because a lot of times you would think that they're the beginning of an issue, but they're often not. So you just could get like a random scene. I'm pretty sure I remember the Once and Future one, because I think there was a trailer for that one too. And I don't remember I don't think it did start at the beginning.
No, it's like in the middle of the book.
Yeah. The funny thing about Once and Future is I feel like there's always kind of a glow to that book. And like, there's like almost, I when I'm thinking about it, I can think of like, there's like a green to the backgrounds, and maybe I'm just like totally like mistaking that or something like that. But for some reason that's in my head. But I mean, I do think it's interesting, because that stuff up front where you're, establishing the palette and sorting everything out, is it kind of like, for line artists, they talk about how layouts are really like the problem solving phase. And then like when you're actually executing it, a lot of it's just like, or like inking, it's really just like you're kind of getting everything taken care of. You're executing what you've already kind of put together. Is it kind of like that for you in that divide, where it's like the beginning is all problem solving, and then from there it's executing that existing vision?
It's pretty comparable. I don't think it's as intensive as it would be for like layouts and having to do initial designs and stuff.
Sure.
But it's definitely the part that requires the most like intense focus and thought on things. Yeah. And another thing that's kind of unfortunate sometimes is like, because previews have these fast turnarounds, it's like, this is the thing that's going to establish the book that I have to do kind of under this intense time pressure at a time when I don't have the time. And that's sometimes not really conducive to how you want to work on a book. And it kind of can lock you into decisions that later you're like, oh God, I wish I had more time, because I would have made better decisions.
I feel like that's one of those times where you definitely don't want one of the, because we were talking earlier about how sometimes, if you look back on your work and you're like, oh God, why did I make that decision? That is the most inopportune time for that to happen.
Yeah.
Let's say you did those, like, let's say it's a 5-page preview for Once and Future, and you do that and you were like, oh God, what did I do? And everyone's like, this is brilliant, I love it. And you're like, fuck, now I have to do this forever.
Yeah, kind of the the dot effect on that book is kind of that situation of like, a lot of times I don't, like I said, I usually try to wait to read the script until right when I'm going to work on a book, because I'll forget, and I'm going to miss things. So if I get like, oh, you have to do this preview, it's like, oh, you have to read the script, which really doesn't take much time, but there's something about like, it's like, ugh, I have to like read and think, and like, I don't want to do it. I just want to sit down and work. So, I try to get what I can. I think at that stage we didn't have all the art because it was so early for the preview. I don't remember. It might have been, but
I feel like it was really early, because I think they were debuting it like at Comics Pro or something. And so because of that, they had to be really ahead of time or something. I don't know. Like, there's sometimes really wonky stuff that pops up like that, and you're just like, yeah, that has nothing to do with it. I'm actually looking at the preview right now, and I don't know. I have to say, speaking of, Once and Future, I find your collaboration with Dan Mora to be, I don't know, you guys, the two of you just jive really well. And maybe that's just me as an outsider, but I know you did. God, I don't even remember what title it's for, but it's for one of the Ten of Swords tie-ins. Like you did
Oh yeah.
a cover that just came out for that. Does it feel different when you fit better with someone? Like, you've been working with Ramon Villalobos for like forever.
Yeah.
Is that, does it feel different when like there's like an in sync element to it, or is it more just about finding the right answers no matter the line artist you're working with?
No, I definitely think there are artists that, I will click with like a lot better, and it doesn't feel like a struggle, like it's like, okay, there's something I can't even necessarily articulate why,
Right.
but there's just something that like makes sense working with this artist. And it's not even always related to like, I mean, Dan is amazing, to be clear about that. But sometimes it's not even like this art is better than this art or this, like, because sometimes there's art that's like maybe not as polished as some other art that like I still feel like I click with it for some reason. And there's something about like us, like you said, working, there's like a sync up there.
Mm-hmm.
And then some art can feel kind of tedious to color, even if it's good art. Like it's not a knock on the art. There's just something about the process of working on it that's not like clicking. But yeah, like I feel like with Dan, and I'm very lucky. Like he seems happy with what I'm doing with him too, and I love working with him. He's like I said, he's amazing. So I am very happy to work with him as long as possible.
Yeah, I don't know what it is about you two, but it's just, I remember last year I was doing my end of the year awards, and I gave the two of you, I think it was like art team of the year basically, because they're just from like the first issue. I remember even just the first preview, so I apologize because that was something that was putting you into a position with the dots that you were not enthusiastic about. But I remember seeing it and I was just like, what the hell? Like there's just something about it that just pops, and I don't even know why. I feel like Ramon's gonna be mad at me because I'm talking up Dan instead of him, but it's true. I'm sorry, Ramon.
Yeah, the dots were not so much a mistake. It's just that like I had this piece, this slice of the book,
right,
and that solution to me made sense for that. And like looking back on it, the effect there is pretty different than the other stuff. It's, again, like you said, probably no one else is going to notice, but for me it's obvious because there was this big open background to all of that stuff.
Like
also,
I
didn't even
pink
know that
sky
book
and everything.
like, yes, like an open, like, yeah, the sky.
Mm-hmm.
So there was like a lot of room to like throw those in the background where there are like foreground elements blocking it, like the figures, and that's like a different effect to like then at a certain point. Then I see the end of the issue, which is the same kind of magic effect, and it's like, oh, how do I do this? Because now it's like heavily inked. They're in this like underground like tunnels and stuff, and it's like, oh, I can't do that same effect, like exactly the same way. And so it's like, I don't know, dots it is, I guess, because it's like I'm trying to replicate that, but like in a different way, and it just kind of evolved from that like that thing, and it worked out fine. But sometimes it's like those are definitely decisions I maybe would have done differently if I had the whole like picture up front.
I'm looking at the preview pages right now, and I can see what you're talking about, but. I mentioned Ramon. I mentioned Dan. You also worked with Nick Darrington a lot on the my God, Doom Patrol books. I'm curious, like those more lasting collaborations. Are those? I guess it really probably depends, but how how do those come together and then stick together? Because I think that's one of the things that's interesting about colorists is. For lack of a better word, it seems like a lot of line artists and colorists kind of form like lasting marriages where, I mentioned Matt Wilson earlier. Matt Wilson, he works with, oh my God, now I'm spacing, Chris Somney. He works with like Chris Anka. He works with a whole, I think there's like a small crew of people that he consistently works with. And those are just kind of, he is their guy and they are his guys. How, with those things, are those more like for each of those, were those more arranged partnerships, or is it just like, does it just depend on the project?
Oh yeah, it's definitely dependent. Like in the case of Dan or Dan Moira and Nick Darrington, those were like assignments I was brought on to. Like
right.
I don't as far as I know, I don't think maybe they requested me or something. But we didn't have any like pre-existing relationship outside of that. But with like Ramon, I knew him personally before I started working with him. So like we have like a chat group that we do pretty regularly. And at a certain point, it's like, I don't remember what I first did with him, if it was like a cover or if it was like a couple of like like 4-page, 8-page things randomly. But yeah, we just over time just kind of work together as often as we can. Like we each have to do our own things sometimes, but I definitely like when that develops. I guess it has to be mutual too, right? Of like,
Right.
there's people that I click with, but then it's like those people like doesn't necessarily mean someone's gonna like feel like that's the best fit for them. So like, but when it is in sync together, then that's when you hopefully start developing more long term partnership on those types of things. But also sometimes especially if if an artist is newer doing like a Marvel or DC thing and they don't really feel like they can throw their weight around, ask for specifics, they might get paired up with people outside of that too. So some of it's dependent on that. But I find that the editors and stuff are usually pretty open, and since I'm working with Marvel and DC anyway, it probably makes it a little easier if people like request me to work on something.
Do you ever turn into a megalomaniac when you see one of your frequent partners working with somebody else?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, it's I recognize it for what it is, but there's definitely that feeling sometimes of like, how dare you, like how like there's a little like sting sometimes, but like I said, people got to do what they got to do. Like we're all leading our own lives, and sometimes it can be kind of hard if you have a lot of people. Like for me, if I have a lot of people that I enjoy coloring, that sometimes it's like there's only so many things you can do at once. So you might have someone who you love working with, and they're doing something but just doesn't time out, and it's like, oh man, like I want to make sure I can fit this in, but sometimes you just can't.
Do you have a good sense for like what capacity is for you?
I do and I don't. I do, and sometimes I go above and beyond a little bit. I've been trying to dial back over the years, but the pandemic stuff has really kind of thrown a real wrench into that system for me, because
you don't want to say no because you don't know when the next option is.
Yeah, I think as a lot of people have learned during this pandemic, as they had to start working from home, that I've gotten a lot less of those like, oh, you work from home, you're so lucky kind of things, that there's a lot of great things about working from home, but there's a lot of trade-offs too.
Right.
And there's like a real melting of like your personal time into your work time that's hard to separate, even when I have these separate spaces, but especially before. And it's hard to do. And I had to very consciously work on like having regular social engagements outside of work to maintain that like the balance a little bit better, because what I do is my schedule just kind of like expands to fill what time is there. So if I don't like claim some of that time for myself, I'll do the same amount of work in more time for no reason, like just because it's the focus problem or whatever. And without being able to do those social things as much, it's definitely kind of fallen back into that mode of things. So sometimes having more work actually makes me more productive or like more efficient. But there's definitely a point where you don't want to go beyond. Like I've definitely gotten to burnout various times, and it can be a struggle to work through.
Well, and I imagine too that the idea of what your capacity is could shift depending on the situation you're in, and what everything what the world is going like. I do want to say too, though, I hate to keep bringing up Matt. For some reason, I keep bringing up Matt. I guess it's just because he's a colorist. But at the same time, I think I had him on the podcast in my first year, and we were talking about the capacity question basically, and he was saying he could do about 6 books a month, and he was saying I was like, well, what if you did less? Like, would your job, like, would your ability to do your job, like, improve? Would you all of a sudden become, like, a super colorist or something like that? It's like, no, I'd just take longer to do each of the books.
Right, exactly.
I thought that was really funny.
Yeah, that's the tricky part, is finding that balance where, like, it keeps you busy enough that you stay productive, but it's not too much that you're burning out. And I feel like 6 is probably my limit as well, but that's kind of like an upper limit that I don't really want to approach.
Well, and I imagine it depends a lot on the project too, because like, the Trap, which is, a Kickstarter book that you were doing, that's a graphic novel, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's, an issue of Once and Future and the Trap are probably, I don't know I don't know how materially different a graphic novel would be for you versus a single issue series. Is there a difference there?
Well, the one danger of those is it's my brain only treats it as if it's one giant single issue, which I mean it is, but
Right.
sometimes it's like, well, it's not due until then, and that can be a dangerous thing, you know. Instead of having like intermittent deadlines where you're doing like 20 pages or so at a time versus, you know, like 60, 70. I don't know how many pages that is exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be bad when you should break it up and you don't.
Yeah, that's true. Because you
You're
look at
kind
it
of
as one
forced
issue,
to.
and you're like, oh wait, this is like 4 issues. Shit.
Right. But you know, like that's just a thing you have to be aware of. But it's definitely gotten me in trouble in the past of like scheduling wise. But as far as otherwise, it's fine. Like, you know, it's totally dependent on art for me is the main thing. Like there's some artists, it does not take very long to color them. There's other artists that, you know, could take quite a bit longer. And then, you know, varies even between artists because it's like this page is like a pretty simple couple figures standing around in a simple background. This page has like 100 characters just, you know, like standing in a complicated background or doing like a big fight or like special effects and stuff.
Well, you know, let's use a couple examples. Like Nick Darrington and Ramon are like dramatically different stylistically. Is your process any different for them, like how you approach them, or is it really just it's pretty similar? It's just there's different elements to each of them.
Yeah. The process of how I work on any book is basically the same.
Right.
It's just more of a matter of like, how do I render this? And not the actual working process. The one big exception to that was when I did Firebug with Johnny Christmas, because he wanted a like a watercolor look to it. And this is the first time I started experimenting with like these watercolor brushes, which I use a lot now, even when I don't do that style. And I've worked with him. I'd worked with him before. That was a creator-owned thing where it was like he was writing and drawing it, and I felt like I had we really clicked too, like artistically. And so I was like, you know what, I'll do this because that process was very different, and then I tried to build it up as much like an actual watercolor process as possible. And which I like, if you don't know about watercolor, you build up, you don't really subtract, and there's no like opaque coloring. Like if you were using acrylics or oils and you wanted to paint white over something, you know, you can do that, or any color. But watercolors, they build up dark layers of darkness, right? So you want to start from white and then build from there. I started to cheat it a little bit as I went on because it's like, well, it's still digital. I don't have to be that slavish to making it look like watercolor. But that process was very different. Like, because normally I have the flats, which I color correct to be like the correct base colors. And then I just build up rendering on top of that. So I have like a shadow layer that adds shadow to that, and lighting layers that add lighting to it. But when I was doing that, I didn't work that way. I used the flats only for selection purposes, and I would just build it up as if I was watercoloring it. So that was a pretty different working process for me. But it's the only time I've done that. I'd be too afraid to do that for like a Marvel or DC thing or anything where there could be like bigger changes that would affect a lot of things because it's so built up. It's hard to like go back and change one element that isn't like fundamental to like, you just have to recolor this now. But the way I normally work is pretty easy. I can adjust like the color of the lighting. I can adjust the color of the shadow I did. All this stuff is saved. Like it's not like destructive. A lot of people work on one layer where you might have to redo a lot of that stuff, but mine is built up in stages of different rendering that are still saved in those layers. So like if I had like a blue shadow and it's like, we don't like the lighting on this, I could turn it to like a red shadow or whatever, or like some character is wearing a shirt and it's like, oh, that should be this color. I could easily change it because I'm just changing the flats, and all the rendering that lays on top of it still applies to what the flats are.
Yeah.
And it's just, it makes it very easy, streamline the process to make changes very easily and be consistent between pages.
I feel like every once in a while that layers conversation comes up between colorists where it's like one layer versus a lot of layers. And I remember I could have sworn, I swear that I saw a conversation once where somebody was incredulous by how many layers you use, which is, I think, a lot. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm Team Tamra. It makes sense to me to have all those different ones, because then it's like, if you don't need that element, you turn it off, as opposed to have to go back and fix it on that one layer.
Yeah. Especially for interior pages. There are times when I've done covers and I'll do it a little bit more freeform or something, although I haven't done that in a while. But like because there are some trade-offs to working that way, but like consistency is the big one, like that is very important for doing interior pages. Some people will try to work on multiple pages at the same time in order to make them consistent, but it's like that's too much to juggle for me. I can't think that way. Like I have to do one page at a time. But also like, okay, we're on issue 13 of Once and Future. If they go back to a place that's in an earlier issue or something, what I have to do, I just have to try to recreate this from scratch. Like, that's a nightmare. So I have all of that saved. So the lighting will look exactly the same. The shadow colors will be the same, unless I make, sometimes I'll make little tweaks over time if I think I could do it a little better, but still keeping it where it looks recognizable. And that's just like, I don't know how. I mean, they do it, like there's people that work on one layer or fewer layers and they manage it. So it's possible. But for me, like, I can't think that way. And it just stresses me out trying to like get back to the same point. But like, I'm guessing at what I'd done like months ago or something.
Yeah. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I have to imagine that speeds up the process too, because not having to recreate the wheel when you go back to places like that, especially, I mean, Once in Future, there are like consistent places that you go.
Yeah.
And so then you don't have, like, if you go to the retirement home, or if, the varying woods, the lots of woods action going on, I have to imagine that's a lot more consistent. But, I did want to ask about one of your collaborators, because you worked on Once in Future, you worked on Ludocrats. It could be coincidence. Maybe you just happened to like do 2 consecutive Kieran Gillen projects, but does it ever happen where that partnership isn't formed with the artist, but it's with the writer, and they just like your work? And I mean, is that what happened, or is it just semi-coincidental?
It's slightly coincidental. I mean, like I was asked to do the Boom project, or do Once in Future, and then we started working on Ludocrats after that. And because we were working on that, I assume is why, then Kieran Gillen asked me to work on that with him. And yeah, like those early, like I said, that early like string of things that got me to a more established career early on were mostly from writers. Because it was a couple writers that, like were like hanging around the Kubert School looking for new people to graduate, working with those artists. And I would like color one of those artists, and now I know that writer, and I worked with that writer who worked with a different artist, and now I'm doing stuff with that artist, but he also recommends me to other writer friends of him. Like Tim Daniel was like one who had like kind of put me in touch with a lot of people early on when I got to work with him. So like, yeah,
he knows everybody.
Yeah. I'm trying to think, like, there doesn't seem to have been any writer recently that I've like consistently worked with the way I have artists. But it's definitely a thing that has happened where I've worked with, artists or writers multiple times where they've asked me to do things like Curtis Weeb, when I was doing Rat Queens, had asked me to do Pisces, with Johnny Christmas, which is where I got to know Johnny Christmas. But yeah, like it does feel like that is less consistent, at least in recent times for me, like writers I'm working with. But they still will like ask me to do other projects sometimes.
Yeah, I imagine to a certain degree, because when you're kind of coming up, and like when you're like a, let's say Curtis Weeb, because I remember when Curtis was coming up and there was like Rat Queens, and there was, what was the book he did with Scott Kowalczyk? I got nothing. But anyways, I mean, when you're coming up, it's kind of like the writer is in some ways like the role of the publisher, because you're kind of making these teams, you're making the creative teams yourself, as opposed to like Boom, who I think, is it Eric Harburn that edits Once in Future?
No, it's Amanda LaFranco.
Oh, Amanda LaFranco. So it's like Amanda is like, to a certain degree kind of forming that team. But when it comes to the creator owned, for like, especially for newer creators like Curtis, I imagine a lot of that forming, that role then falls upon the writer, who's trying to like marry all these people together. And I imagine the further you get into your career, it's like that kind of shifts a bit.
Yeah, I guess it is like, it does seem like artists and colorists team to like pair up, because, like that's the more like,
the natural pairing. Right.
So I think they might tend to, ask for their own colorist, like that they're comfortable with. And that, I don't think that's always going to trump what the writer wants, and probably often doesn't, especially if they're newer. But yeah, that would make sense why you'd probably work with artists more consistently than writers. But like I said, I do have writers that will ask me to work on other projects of theirs and stuff. It's just sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, I just thought the Kieran thing was interesting because it was really that, there was Once and Future, and then Dye came in and Stephanie Hans does, paints herself. And then there was Ludocrats, and I was just like, that's interesting. Like 2 of the last 3 Kratorn projects were colored by Tamra. So I wasn't sure if there was something there, but I had a couple of patron questions. One was specific. Actually, it was one person who really, Keegan Ray, loves flavor.
Okay.
Absolutely loves flavor. But actually was asking about what's the difference between, or if there's a difference between coloring like a creator-owned book like Flavor versus something that's for hire like Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur. Is there any notable difference in freedom or anything, or is it much the same in terms of everything you do?
Often it is the same, but it depends on what it is. Even Marvel and DC stuff, it probably depends on the type of project it is. Like Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, I pretty much just did whatever I wanted, there'd be notes and stuff, but there was no restrictive, like you can't do this or that. But that's kind of like a less conventional looking like superhero book, so it's like I feel like they're leaning into that more anyway. So I think sometimes I've not run into this in like any major way, but like sometimes I think if you do more like standard superhero stuff, and maybe if it's like also more of their like flagship titles or something, you might get a little bit more like this needs to be literally red, this needs to be blue, kind of thing, where they start to balk at colored lighting a little bit. And it's like, no, this costume is literally this color. It has to be this color. Like, when it shows up, Superman is blue, kind of thing sometimes. But even that, like, it hasn't been anything too ridiculous. And once you learn that, like, and I think part of being a colorist too, though, is like adapting to a situation of like, well, this is what they're going to want for this. So I try to make it work with, what works in my aesthetic, but still is giving them what they want. So I haven't found it too bad, but I definitely think with creator-owned stuff, you just have more freedom because you can do what you want. You don't really answer to anyone.
Right.
And as I said with that Firebug book, that's why I chose that book to do that watercolor style on, because I felt most comfortable in that book that I would not have to make big sweeping changes that would cause me to redo a lot of work. And I would like practically never, unless it was a very specific type of project, try to do that on a work for hire book.
Is it, for like that Firebug book, is it interesting to take a project like that for you because it pushes your coloring in a different direction and maybe you learn something there that you might be able to apply elsewhere?
Oh yeah. That's another thing that's really great about coloring, is because I get to work with so many different people, and sometimes I want to try something new, or I like stumble into something new, or just figure something out. And it's like you're learning something new from each of these things. And because the artists often are so different from each other, because I do try to work with different artists, it's like I'll pick something up. And in the Firebug example, like I said, I went out and was like, okay, I need to find some watercolor brushes if I'm going to do this, because I'm not going to do it physically, I'm going to do it digitally still. And I got some of those brushes and figured that out. And then I started trying to use those brushes to render the way I normally have my file setups. And it's like, well, I still like the way this looks. It gives some kind of like texture, or, has this different feel to it that I like. I'm not trying to make it look like a watercolor book, like it's actually, built up the way you would watercolor, but it does something for the rendering. So like, that's a piece that is like, I've used a lot since then. And there's a lot of examples like that, where there's like something that requires me to go out of my way to do something specific for a book, that it's like, sometimes that works its way into my repertoire of things for like books going forward.
Mm-hmm. I just, this is weird, and this could be totally wrong, but I just assume that whenever anybody in comics talks about brushes, that it's like Kyle T. Webster brushes, because...
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, it's like he kind of does them all. And I just always think it's really interesting whenever he comes up, because it's like sometimes the brushes you discover kind of unlock something that like you weren't capable of before. And I find that fascinating.
Yeah, like... Because I had always kind of, like, for the most part of my career, I've used, like starting out is like, I'm just using basic round brushes, and I'll figure out how to render with those. And, I might have a couple, like, textured brushes or something. But, like, yeah, I've added a few. I'm not, like, a person that uses, like, a ton of different brushes. I just can't, my mind can't wrap itself around, like, too many things like that to keep in mind, because then that's just, like, another thing that I have to remember. Like, oh, do I use this brush to do this effect? Da, 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 da. So I try my best to do things with like pretty basic setup of brushes, but I have like a little bit of an expanded repertoire of brushes now that I use for specific things, or they give it like a little, like I like those watercolor brushes because it's like it gives the rendering a little bit more kind of life to it. That's not just like flat and perfectly digital looking stroke or something. And the extent to which I use it varies on projects. Some projects I might never use that because it just calls for a really like slick looking type of look. But if something wants like a little bit more organic look to it, I'll kind of work those into some rendering.
Yeah. I imagine brushes are kind of like a thing that would be bad to be a jack of all trades but a master of none. Like you don't want to be a jack of all brushes because if you're like okay at every brush, that's kind of contradictory to what you want to do. It's like having a home row of brushes that you know really well and you know what they do. That probably is more beneficial than you're like, I have every brush and I am 30% okay at all of them.
Yeah, and I don't use any it's very few that I use as like primary brushes. Like it's mostly like this is to add a little texture or something, at least how I use them. And I had like, there's a shortcut in Photoshop where you can just cycle through your brushes with a key. So it has to be a low amount of brushes or else I don't know, because right now I can be like, oh, I'm on this brush. It's 3 clicks this way to get me to the other brush I want. And it's just like ingrained in me at this point of like doing that. So there's only so much I can add to it before it like, breaks apart.
Yeah. This is a terrible analogy, but it's like sometimes I make Spotify playlists and then I have way too many songs on there and I cycle between songs and I'm like, when is the next song I actually want to listen to going to come up?
Yeah, like going through I use those Kyle T. Webster brushes, the watercolor ones, but like, I don't know if you've ever seen those. There's tons of them.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure.
There's like, I don't know how many, like easily 100, I think, or more. And it's like, I can't remember the specific watercolor brush to do this. So I had to like spend an amount of time like just playing with the brushes and being like, okay, this one seems general enough that like I can conceive of how I would use this. And I narrowed it down to 3 brushes and really I use like 2 of them.
Yeah. Like
watercolor brushes. That some people can like easily like switch between them and find the right brush for the right occasion. But it's like, if it gets to be too many for me, I can't keep up with it anymore.
How much of it is with those types of things? How much of it is feel? Like you know how to use it based off of feel rather than like his, you know when you put your pen, your stylus down that it's going to have this effect. Like is that like really like a really crucial element to being able to color is just like knowing or expecting a result and it actually happening?
Yeah, it's hard to explain. But yeah, it's definitely like there is definitely something about like, okay, this brush just feels right. It does what it wants. Because even testing the brushes, sometimes I'll test them, like on a blank canvas or something, and it's like, that's a cool effect. I have no idea what I'd ever use it for, but that looks cool, and I want to hang on to it. So I have kind of like a tray of brushes that like I'll put stuff there, like, okay, you're on probation kind of brushes,
Yeah.
Like we'll figure out if this can apply to stuff. And sometimes I work those a little bit into rotation. I don't have them like in my like the row that is like my key brushes that I can cycle through, but I'll have to like select them specifically. So I have like I have less than 10 brushes that I actually cycle through, and then there's like a handful of other ones I might go to every now and then to get a certain texture for things.
Sometimes I really like, this is a weird thing to say, I like fonts. Fonts are very, like there can be some really cool fonts. And sometimes I'll go on these font sites and I'll look at it and I'm like, man, this is so cool. And then I get it and I'm like, why do I have this? I will literally never use this. This is not useful.
I get overwhelmed by like, too much choice. So I have to narrow the range of things, or else I'll just agonize over which specific brush I should use instead of like it's not that important. Just do it. Does it look right? Okay, you're good.
I support this. This is like my tiny menu theory for restaurants. It's like if you go to a restaurant that has way too many options, you're like, it's going to be a bunch of things that are going to be okay. But if you go to a place that has like 6 items, they're all going to be killers. And I support that. But one other question that the patron Keegan Ray had was, are there any, you have kind of this core group of artists you work with. You also do other projects and everything. Are there any specific line artists you'd really like to color?
Oh,
I know that's like a really tough question because it's like if you could pick, it's like the big menu theory again.
Yeah,
you could pick anybody.
I'm always bad with those kind of questions. There are definitely artists. Oh, God, like a lot of them I've worked with already. Like I've worked with Trad a few times, and it's like I think we have like a cool thing going on. Trad more, but I've worked with him. I'm trying to think. There's I'm probably gonna say her name wrong, but Bilquis Evie, Elvie.
Oh yeah, yeah.
She's amazing. But I think Matt Lopez is coloring her right now in that was it like a Sandman
I
book or
think it's the
something?
Dreaming. I could be totally
Dreaming.
wrong about that, but
I
yeah.
mean, look, they're a great pairing. But
Hmm.
like I definitely like I look at her art and there's something about it, like that looks fun to color and like that's there's some artists that will like I'll just see them and their stuff looks it's just like there's something about it that not only a good artist but like that this is like something there is like it looks like it would be fun to like mess with this and do something here.
That's interesting. So it's not just like a qualitative thing; it's almost another feel thing for you.
I do think that is that often like because there's artists that I like I said like there's artists that I think are great artists that I could be miserable coloring. That it's not because there's anything wrong with their art, just because the way that I have to approach it like doesn't feel good to do. It might get a good effect, and again, it's no knock on their artwork, but just sometimes that doesn't line up with like someone being good,
Right.
like and what feels good to work on.
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting divide. I mean, it's like, you may have loved Joe Madureira when you were younger, but it's like, would you really want to color him today? I don't know. I mean, not that he's drawing comics anyways,
Yeah.
but still. Well, I want to close talking about like, I mentioned this before we started recording it. I always like it when people kind of step or speak up for the role that they have, and comics are really
Yeah.
interesting because like when line artists have a tendency of like getting less credit, not less credit, but it's just like it's tough for people to speak about it sometimes. Colorists are perhaps even worse because like I don't think a lot of people know how, like, honestly, one of the things I was going to ask you is to like, I feel like I know what it is, but like specifically rendering sometimes trips me up because it
Hmm.
seems like a very versatile term because you talked about shadows and you talked about light sources and
Right.
it's like those are both of those things. But why is it important to you seemingly to kind of positively affect what people know and think of colorists? Like, why is that important to you?
Well, I think any of us, like work, especially working in creative fields or fields where you're putting your work out there, you want to be recognized for what you're doing. That's part of why you're doing it, right? And so it's nice to have that recognition. And I'm fortunate at this point to I'm not as dependent on like if the name's not on the cover or like this or that. Like it's still can be pretty annoying or like like it'd be nice to be credited there, but it's not as critical to for me to get more work. Like I'm at a point where I don't really have to worry about that too much. But with people that are starting out, I think that's very critical for them. Like there are times when I try to like I go out of my way if I'm promoting a book to try to credit everybody on that book.
Right.
Editors, letterer, whoever else is working on it. And sometimes, especially with letterers, I find I have to like go on a hunt to
Oh
find them.
yeah.
Like it's hard. Um, you know, Comixology doesn't share the credits pages on there. So if they're not listed, and colorist and letter is often left off of there, you can't find it out from there. Maybe you can go to like one of those comic book database type sites, right, and look it up. But it's like I'm assuming the same letterer is on this issue than was on the last issue. I hope it's the same person.
Hmm.
So oftentimes it's best guess, and that's me doing it when I'm putting in that effort.
Right.
So if someone like is starting out working on something and they don't get credited, that like name recognition is huge. Like to get more work for people to see you. That's part of why you do certain things. Like if you do a cover, like right, like especially starting out, you do that, because you like your job and you like doing it and for the money, but you also like I need this. This is a good like advertisement for my work. And if you don't have your name on it, you're not being advertised. So you're
Hmm.
being like cheated out of like what you should be getting from it. And to what end? Like, what does that hurt them to include you on that?
Yeah.
Like I get surprised by that. Like, I had mentioned recently, like there's a couple of covers or stuff that have gone out, and like I don't ever get credited. I was like, I didn't even know I could share this.
Like
I
that
didn't
X-Men
know.
cover, right?
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
And and it's just a strange thing that's like a higher up thing, I guess. I don't know who decides this. Like if you look on Comixology, I'm not credited to a single Marvel comic that I've colored. DC does, and most of the other places I've worked with, I'm sure there's stuff missing, but that's just a strange decision to me. that, I don't put that on any editors, but like somewhere along the line, someone is deciding when we send solicit information to like reviewers, to Comixology, which is the main way to, read comic books digitally, we don't send them that information. And why? It's just one more name. They have it and they have the ability to add it. But that's, it's a strange thing. And
Yeah.
again, for me, it's mostly like frustrating, but for some people that can be critical for like getting more work.
Hmm.
That's one of the things starting out that again, part of it's just I wanted to color, of course, and, liked having money. But doing a lot of work gets your name in front of a lot of people, and they just start to like, if through sheer like force of will and volume, you can be like, hey, I recognize that name now because I keep seeing it. And I'm also lucky to have a very unique name, so that helps. But if you're someone starting out, you need that, and if it's denied you, then that could cost you work.
Yeah. I mean, I honestly, the thing that's always perplexed me about this is I've made this argument before, but I actually think colorists are probably the best barometer for me as to whether or not I'm going to like a book because, we talked about this before, I think probably before we were recording, but you're able to do a wide range of books. But because of that, like let's say you're only allowed to do 6 books, that means you are probably picking books that you find interesting or you find worthwhile. And so because of that, if I love your work, then you're kind of acting as the tastemaker for me. And so there's some colorists where I pretty much buy, like, I'll buy any comic that you do. I'll buy any comic that like Matt Wilson does, shockingly, given the fact that's like the 10th time I mentioned. But, it's like those types of things, I think even from a pragmatic capitalist angle are meaningful. But on the flip side, as you're noting, it's like, it's also really important to, younger creators, because bringing it back to the covers, I think the covers are interesting too, because covers are maybe more than like interior pages are more likely to get shared a lot on social media. And if your name is not attached to it, it's like you're not even there. And
Right.
and that's one of the covers I often find to be even harder to find credit for because, or specifically for colors, but even sometimes for especially because there's often so many damn variants, it's hard to figure out who the hell did something.
Right.
And so it's interesting because like it to me as an outsider, there's like no downside to including those names, and there's plenty of upside. And it seems bewildering to not do that.
Right. Yeah.
I
In
know
an
I'm
industry
preaching to
where,
the choir there.
oh yeah. I mean, like even if it's just a small number, like getting that out to more people, like advertising your product you're putting out there, like I don't know why you would deny that yourself that for no reason. Because like the colorists I know, like, they put a lot of love into their work and they would share it gladly. And sometimes, we're not included with that. It's very discouraging and sometimes make you not really want to invest that so much of yourself in promoting something if you're doesn't feel like your contribution is being valued.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting because when you get to the position where you're at, where you're regularly working and you're getting increasingly significant projects and everything like that, it's almost like you have to, I don't know, there's 2 things you could do. You could either just do your work or you could, try to make decisions that positively affect the totality of your occupation. And it's almost like you have to make, I don't know, it's like you can't just consider like, am I making this choice because it benefits me? But also it's like you kind of want to make decisions to benefit everyone. And so I don't know. I mean, I just think it's interesting because it's like, to a certain degree, I almost feel like that's a lot to ask out of anybody, especially when like there are things that don't seem like they should be, like you even need to ask for them, but you still have to do it. It's
Right.
like you have to ask for that higher page rate because it benefits all colorists. You have to ask for credit because it benefits all colorists. And that's just like a really interesting position to be put in and like a lot of pressure, I imagine.
Yeah. And just sometimes like it can be a little anxiety inducing, like you finding the right tone to strike when you're speaking up sometimes, because I've definitely had people sometimes surprisingly get very bent out of shape about asking for basic levels of
Credit.
credit sometimes, and it's very strange because I mean, I dare you to find a writer that wouldn't throw a fit if they got left out of so you know what I mean, like
Yeah.
But rightfully so, but like that they have that you know, not all writers but they, you know, they might have that sense of entitlement for that, but if you ask for the same thing, then all of a sudden they're resentful for like, why do you think you deserve the same amount that I do? That's not most writers. I have a very good experience working with writers who are very generous for that, and you know, easy to share everybody's involvement with the book. But there are people out there that you know, kind of stuff will rub them the wrong way, or you know, who knows who you've kind of like annoyed out of like a potential working relationship, you know, with that kind of stuff. So it's like try to strike a balance, but at the same time, it's like you said, it's pretty basic like stuff that should be accepted. That you know, like I don't know, I feel like it's worth speaking up at least sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny though, because it's like I find that the majority of the people who actually really weirdly like motivate me to buy comics often are not. Sorry, writers. This is not me. This is not me being obstinate either. It's like writers can be inconsistent from time to time, and as much as I love a lot of writers' work, it's like sometimes it's like a story just doesn't jive with me. But it's like if I know, like I really love Will Moss, like I find that almost all of his comics I really enjoy, and so it's like Will Moss is like a tastemaker for me, or like Tom Muller, like as a designer, it's just like when he's working on a book, I'm like I know that book is gonna look cool, and I like books that look cool, and so I don't know, it's just. I'm apparently an advocate for crediting everyone. So I'm the right person for you to talk to.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like on comics, like you're like what on the outside you're dealing with what like 10 people, like at most, if and it's usually less than that, you know.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem very difficult to do, even though like you know, like I said, when I promote stuff, it can be a little you know like I really got to go hunt for somebody, make sure they're on Twitter or not, like see their handle if I don't know it already.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really take that long. And, you know, like I feel like I know I don't like it when I get left out of those things. So I try to, you know, go out of my way to make sure that if you work on this book, I am including you with this because you are important in its creation, whoever you are. If you're a writer and artist, of course, you know, but other like a letterer, editors, if there's like a designer, you know, sometimes we have other roles on the book. Like those people deserve to be included as well.
Hell yeah. I totally support that. And I love that idea. I love your work. Tamra, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about coloring comics, your path to comics, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with colorist Tamra Bonvillain. You can find Bonvillain on Twitter at @TBonvillain, and her work in Once and Future, Ludicrats, The Jump, and the upcoming Future State, The Next Batman, and King in Black, Return of the Valkyries. Off Panel is once again brought to you by Sketch.com. Check out Sketch, my subscription comic site for long-form articles, interviews, and more, and consider subscribing for access to all the site's content and its members-only forum. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to weekly content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on iTunes or Spotify and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking on Facebook at /Sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Guarino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein-Cute, SB, Antonio Offen, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Scotty Young, Susanna Polo, Jeff Weira, Bree Hinkley-Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Phil Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pacello, Torin Grumbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Salate, Sakil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Liana Kingus, Keegan Roy, Wesley Gift, Sean Kirkham, Harry Small, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Ranwan, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Phil White, Sean Pinell, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Nassy, Adam Bogart, Xavier Files, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Brawley, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Cole McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Chris Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comic Star in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.